Ah, the joys of technology. This morning, Scott Roberts is going to present the historicity. How do you pronounce that properly? Historicity? Okay, perfect. I'll fake it again. Of the life of Jesus of Nazareth and his alleged resurrection, or as he refers to it originally in his presentation, what every layperson should know about the life of Jesus of Nazareth and his alleged resurrection. So let's get this off here. Scott tells me he's going to discuss, as an historian, the last week of the life of Jesus of Nazareth, and particularly the historical arguments for and against his resurrection. Scott's a lawyer and a student of philosophy, and he says he has always been fascinated by man's experience of the sacred. So here's a slightly different approach to a supposedly sacred event. So Scott, we're going to be all ears, and I'm going to let you get started as soon as I can get your presentation up on the screen.
Yes, sir.
Wait a minute, I got to get out of the other one. Share.
And here's the clicker. And
Second,
this is,
while we get you up here.
this is pointing out, right? Held that
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
Forward, back, got it.
Slideshow. From beginning. And Scott, it's all yours. Let me get these off here. I guess we'll have to settle for that. All right, Scott, it's all yours.
Lou and Ira, thank you for all your hard work to make this hybrid presentation possible, which hasn't been easy. Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Roberts, and I'm so excited that you are here by way of Zoom and in person, and giving me the opportunity to share my COVID-19 project with you. I've prepared an unusual civil discourse topic which combines two of my passions, philosophy and the law. As an undergraduate, I majored in philosophy and religion, earned a master's degree in philosophy at DePaul University in Chicago, and then I went to law school because I needed to find a job. I was a trial attorney for 33 years. During the COVID-19 shutdown, I had the opportunity to read, to study, and to enjoy many, many biblical scholars discussing, disputing, and opining on multifarious, is not a great word, New Testament issues. I thought it would be challenging to present as a secular historian the arguments for and against the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. I approached this not as a believer or disbeliever of Christianity, but as a historian. I am not invoking faith or disclaiming faith in this presentation. Rather, just as I had many personal injury trials in my practice, I decided to approach the issue of the alleged historicity of the resurrection using the same trial advocacy skills that I used in my personal injury practice. And that will become clear as we go forward. So let's start. What every lay person should know about the life of Jesus of Nazareth and his alleged resurrection. Of course, here's a picture of the kind of tomb that Jesus perhaps was buried in. Going forward. And Lou's helping me out here.
That's cute.
Okay.
There will be a short delay.
Short delay.
Why isn't this thing?
Huh? What did I do wrong?
Bottom button. No, the down arrow.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you, Lou. So the goal of my talk, my purpose in this presentation is to study as a historian the last week of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. I approach this assignment not as a faith believer, as I just mentioned, but as a historian and a trial lawyer. Towards this end, I ask the following question. With respect to the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, what historical arguments exist for and against the resurrection taking place as a historical event? To answer this question, we need to review the historical context of Jesus' execution and his alleged resurrection to answer the following building block questions. Well, Lou called me last night and he said, Scott, I want you to keep your meeting to about 25 minutes to be fair to everyone. So I'm going to skip much of this and I'm going to go down to who is St. Paul. So we're not going to talk about Charlton Heston, right? Sorry, we don't have time to talk about him. And we're not going to talk about Passover, but all of you know about that, the angel of death and putting the blood on the lintel of the door and the angel of death passing over, not killing the firstborn. There was a picture of the temple, crucifixion, moving along. Jesus is an apocalyptic prophet. Interesting, but we're not going to touch on that now. Jesus overthrowing the tables of the money changers in the temple. And finally, we're going to be getting to the slide where I really want to start my presentation. Who is St. Paul and why he is a big deal? Okay. Paul, formerly known as Saul of Tarsus, was a Jewish Pharisee who persecuted Christians. As we all know, on the road to Damascus, he underwent a conversion experience wherein Jesus appeared to him in a flash of light, spoke to him, and commissioned him to be an apostle to the Gentiles. Paul is arguably the most important Christian convert of all time. Without Paul, Christian history as we know it would not have happened. Paul believed that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ brought salvation not just to the Jewish people, but also to the entire Gentile world. Paul is the earliest known author describing Jesus' resurrection, particularly in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which biblical scholars refer to as the resurrection chapter. So what does Paul say in the first letter of Corinthians about the resurrection? And I'll be speaking more about this in a moment, but just so you get the substance of what chapter 15 is about. Paul writes that the resurrected Jesus appeared in chronological order to the following: Peter, to the 12 disciples or original apostles, to James, the brother of Jesus, who was an apostle, but not one of the original 12, and then to more than 500 associates, that's the word he uses in Greek, to whom Jesus appeared all at one time. Okay, the second earliest document describing the resurrection of Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark was written between 60 and 70 AD. Of course, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's the first gospel. What does Mark say in his gospel about the resurrection of Jesus? The Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Council, had Jesus arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and voted in unison, I'm going to come back to that point, that's important, to turn Jesus over to Pontius Pilate for execution. Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea, which is in southern Palestine. Galilee is in northern Palestine. Pilate executed Jesus on Friday for claiming he was king of the Jews. In the Roman Empire, there was only one king, who was the Roman emperor. And on that Friday in the afternoon, Joseph of Arimathea, is a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, petitioned Pilate to bury Jesus in his family burial tomb. Pilate granted this request. Jesus is removed from the cross, wrapped in a shroud, and placed in Joseph's family tomb, the entrance of which is covered by a heavy stone. On Sunday morning, or 3 days after Jesus' burial, three women, Mary Magdalene, a woman named Salome, and Mary, who we presume to be the mother of Jesus, visit the tomb to anoint his body with spices, which was a Jewish practice to honor the dead. But wait, there's more to Mark's story about the empty tomb. When arriving at the tomb, the women discover the following: the stone blocking the tomb is rolled away from the entrance. Jesus' body is gone. A young man in the tomb, clothed in white, tells them that Jesus is risen and not here. He instructs the women to go to Galilee and proclaim the good news of Jesus' resurrection to Peter and the disciples. The women fled from the tomb, were afraid, and said nothing to anyone. okay? That's how the Gospel of Mark ends. So now we get to the piece de resistance of my presentation to you. And that is the arguments for the historicity of the resurrection. And so keep in mind here, where I'm getting my information is from Paul's letter of Corinthians and the Gospel of Mark, the earliest mention in the New Testament, which has 27 books, of the resurrection event. Okay, so I'm going to the earliest references to the resurrection. Okay, so Paul's character for truthfulness. Imagine a personal injury trial wherein the plaintiff, that is to say the injured person, was T-boned at an intersection by the defendant's car. The factual issue before the jury is to determine whether the wrongdoer ran a red light. The wrongdoer says he did, and the plaintiff says he did not, and the plaintiff says he did. In any trial, which I had many of, in any trial, when you call your witness to the witness stand, before you ask them the ultimate question, was the traffic light red or green? Before you do that, you are permitted to ask questions of the witness in order to reveal the person's character. Who are they? What is their vocation? Are they married? Do they have kids? Do they go to church? What charities do they contribute to? Do they volunteer at a food pantry? Do they go at Christmas time with friends to sing to shut-ins at a memory care facility? Do they take their guitar and sing folk songs for cancer patients at the hospital? Are they a big brother, and so on? Okay, why are you doing this as a trial advocate? You're doing it because you want to educate and persuade the jury that the witness is a good person, okay? Why is that important? Because good people tell the truth, okay? So that brings us to St. Paul. So did St. Paul have a reputation for truthfulness, and was he a person of good character? Historically, what do we know about Paul? He was a Pharisee. What kind of a person is that? Okay, I'm still doing okay with my slides. What kind of person is that? A Pharisee was a highly educated rabbi or priest who devoted his life 24/7 to studying Jewish scripture and advising Jews how to live in a correct or a holy relationship with God. As such, it would have been of paramount importance to Paul that he have a reputation for truthfulness and honesty. His vocation depended on it. Further, as an educated leader of the Jewish community, Paul would have devoted his life to following the Jewish commandments, the 10 Commandments, one of which is that one shall not bear false witness. To bear false witness was a sin against God. Paul would have taken this commandment very, very seriously. Okay, let me see if okay, hold it. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I'm a little disjointed here because the computer's over here, the slides are over here, but bear with me, everyone. Okay, further, was Paul a person of good character? It certainly seems so. His writings regarding how we ought to treat one another are some of the most enduring and quoted expositions on ethics ever written. At any wedding that any of us have attended, I am certain the minister has read Paul's wise comments from chapter 13, which is called the chapter of love. Paul's wise comments on the nature of love, that love is patient, love is kind, love endures all things. If I have not love, I am just an empty drum and a clanging cymbal. Now, it's just amazing. That is read at weddings all the time. This is just amazing. This was something written by a rabbi over 2,000 years ago, and we're still quoting it. Okay, what does that mean? Well, I think that we recognize that the person who is the author of this kind of writing is wise and has a profound understanding of the human condition and how we ought to relate to one another. So the first bullet point in favor of the resurrection taking place is that our star witness, St. Paul, has a reputation for honesty and is an excellent witness. Okay, that's bullet point number 1. Okay, I peeked here. You see bullet point number 2. Paul's identifying eyewitness testimony to the resurrection, i.e., remember, Paul identified an inventory of eyewitnesses for the resurrection. And again, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So Paul recognizes that the gold standard of trial advocacy for persuasion is the eyewitness. And we recognize this every day in our lives. When we turn on the news, what does the news say? Eyewitness news. It's not news, well, this is somebody who told somebody who told somebody who told somebody, and we're going to interview the sixth person down the line as to what happened. No, 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 no. We want eyewitness news. Why? Because the gold standard of advocacy is the eyewitness. Let me say something about why the letter of Corinthians was written, which I referred to several slides back. Corinth is a city in Greece, and Paul, as we know, as he moved from Palestine around the Mediterranean basin, he was heading to Spain, which at that time was the end of the world. Okay, that's how they referred to it. But he founded a church in Corinth. He was probably there in 50 AD, 51 AD, probably spent about a year there. He had moved on to create other churches, but he received word probably about 54, 55 AD that the church was falling apart in Corinth. Leaders were fighting. Immoral practices were taking place. Some even disbelieved that Jesus was resurrected at all, which was the cornerstone of the Christian faith for Paul. The ritual of communion was a scene of bedlam, that you had people who were hogging the food and drinking all the wine before other parishioners arrived to the church. There was a stepson who was going to bed with his stepmother. All of this is in the letter of 1 Corinthians. Paul is worried, okay? What he's most worried about, he has to straighten out this church that he's the founding father of, all right? And so in his letter, he wanted to direct advice and correction immediately to the people who disbelieved that the resurrection took place. So as we know, as I showed earlier, in the first letter of Corinthians, Paul says Jesus appeared as resurrected, the resurrection of Christ. Okay, are we doing okay?
Yeah, I started in my gallery.
Okay, as the resurrected Christ to Peter, the 12 disciples, to James, Jesus' brother, and to more than 500 associates. Okay. Paul encouraged those with questions to talk to the people who were eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. To persuade anyone in a court of law, what is more effective than calling eyewitnesses to corroborate the assertion you seek to prove? And that's exactly what Paul is doing, because he recognizes the gold standard of advocacy is the eyewitness. If Paul were a huckster, would he be encouraging troubled converts to talk to those eyewitnesses who had personally experienced Jesus' resurrection? Paul wrote the letter to Corinthians in about 54, 55 AD, and some of the witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, about 20 years before that, would still be alive. And Paul knew that. And he was saying, for heaven's sakes, go seek these people out. Okay, they can give you their eyewitness experience of meeting the resurrected Jesus. Okay, third bullet point, in favor of the resurrection. And as you can see, I've captioned this, oops, sorry, I made a mistake. Can I go home now? Okay, what do I mean by that? Keep in mind that the disciples were fugitives in Jerusalem, complicit in the sedition that led to Jesus' crucifixion. One after another of those who claimed to have witnessed the risen Jesus went to their own gruesome deaths, refusing to recant their testimony. They were ridiculed, imprisoned, starved, beaten, flogged, and crucified. To avoid execution, however, Rome simply asked a Christian to say that his eyewitness account of a risen Jesus was false. So in order to avoid being tortured and crucified, all you needed to say was, oops, sorry, I made a mistake. Can I go home now? All right. And yet universally, the disciples' experience of Jesus' resurrection was so transforming and transfiguring, they couldn't do it. And by doing so, they chose gruesome deaths. Now, true, simply because one decides to die for one's belief doesn't mean that, let me start that sentence over, sorry. Simply because one decides to die for one's belief is not proof that that belief is true. But doesn't it give one pause to think that perhaps what the apostles experienced was real? Does it give us pause? Stated otherwise, is there a difference between a suicide bomber who believes his death will be rewarded in heaven with 12 unblemished virgins and an apostle who dies refusing to recant not a belief, but a personal experience of the resurrected Christ? Okay. That's the argument. That's the distinction. Okay. Moving on. And we've gone through the first three arguments in favor of the historicity of the resurrection. And our last one, and this is fun, you'll enjoy this. The last argument in favor of the historicity of the resurrection is Mark's identifying the women as the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection lends credibility that the story is true. What do I mean by that? According to the Gospel of Mark, Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of Jesus, and Salome visited the tomb. When they arrived, the stone was already rolled back, and they encountered a man dressed in white who proclaimed that Jesus was not there and had been risen or raised. The man in white told the ladies to go to Galilee and to tell the apostle of Jesus' resurrection. In first century Palestine, women were second-class citizens. They could not own property. Their testimony in court was disallowed because men believed their testimony was inherently unreliable. All male Jews thought that women were inherently flaky. You couldn't trust what they said, okay? Christian apologists argue that if someone wanted to invent the story, fabricate the story of the empty tomb and a resurrected Jesus, they would not have made a gaggle of Jewish women the star witnesses of what happened. That doesn't make sense. Their culture doesn't support that. If the story is made up and fabricated to be credible, the author would have used the testimony of male Jews, that is to say, someone whose testimony was respected in a court of law. Stated otherwise, if you create a story to convince people that Bigfoot exists, you don't place in your story an eyewitness to Bigfoot's existence who is inebriated, not wearing his spectacles, and forgot to take his daily dose of villagers' Prevagen to combat the inveterate memory lapses. If you want your story to be plausible, to believable, so that people will accept it as true, you want a witness who has a truth-telling character and whose facilities are razor sharp, not someone who has Alzheimer's, okay? This is exactly what Mark did not do, i.e., place a male Jew as a credible witness at the empty tomb. Accordingly, from the point of view of a biblical historian, the existence of women at the empty tomb in the Gospel of Mark is evidence that the story of the women at the empty tomb is not a fabrication, but historically accurate. Okay, let me switch my lawyer hat. Instead of being the plaintiff, I'm now going to be defense counsel. Now, arguments against the resurrection taking place. Okay, is everybody ready for this? Are you on the edge of your chairs? All right. So let's start. First of all, Paul's story has some puzzling gaps. We need to keep in mind that Paul never met Jesus as a human being and was not an eyewitness to his resurrection. And also he repeats hearsay testimony. Okay, what do I mean by that? He's repeating in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 what other people have told him what they experienced. That is classic hearsay. What is hearsay? Hearsay is an out-of-court statement. So Lou says to me, Scott, I went to Winn-Dixie yesterday, and I want to get that statement into court, okay? So who goes on the witness stand? if I go on the witness stand and I say, Lou said to me that he went to Winn-Dixie yesterday, that's hearsay, that's inadmissible. Lou has to get on the witness stand and say, this is what I said. Okay, why is that important? Because if the eyewitness person is not on the witness stand, the jury is deprived of the opportunity to evaluate that witness's credibility. That is to say, what's the body language of Lou when he gets on the witness stand? Does he look kind of shifty? Does he mumble? But does he speak with confidence? But maybe he doesn't look you in the eye, okay? Things like that. We all use that every day to evaluate a witness's credibility. And so Paul is not giving us eyewitness testimony. He's repeating hearsay, and that can cause reliability problems. Okay, also in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul does not mention any of the women who witnessed the risen Jesus and does not mention the empty tomb. Okay, this is odd. If that took place, and if he's giving an inventory of the witnesses for the resurrection, why wouldn't he mention the women? He doesn't mention them, okay? Thirdly, there is no reference in the book of Acts or in any of the other Gospels that the risen Jesus appeared to 500 associates. Surely if this happened, wouldn't other gospel writers mention it? You know? So there's puzzling gaps in Paul's testimony that could give us concern about whether he's telling us the whole story, all right? Okay, next bullet point, and this is fun. In an effort to market Jesus to the Gentile and pagan world, Christians place Jesus in a mythical narrative framework with which the polytheistic world would have been familiar and would have found credible. By doing so, proselytizing converts was made easier. So keep in mind that after the resurrection, the early Christians, Paul, who was going to proselytize the Gentiles, Peter, who was going to proselytize the Jews, they fanned out and they are trying to sell that, hey, Jesus is the right God to believe. And everyone was a pagan practically, all right? And so the pagan would say, well, why should we believe your God and reject our gods? And so the early Christians, they were marketing geniuses. And they said, you should adopt Jesus as the appropriate God because he's a dying and He's a dying and reviving God. And all of you pagans are very, very familiar with that kind of thinking. This is language you understand. So here we have, for instance, this slide was taken from Jim Lawrence's presentation on Who Wrote the Bible. He shared it with me. He's a great speaker. We have Romulus, all right? All of these are dying and reviving gods. Romulus, who was the founder of Rome. Zalmoxis, who was a dying and reviving god in the Balkans and Southern Europe. Osiris from Egypt, and Jesus from Palestine. From this perspective, the argument is that all of these dying and reviving gods were savior gods. They all were sons of a god. They all had similar passion stories. Keep in mind, when we talk about the passion story of Christ, that's referring to the time that he was arrested in Gethsemane and then to the time that he was executed and crucified, okay? That's the passion story because passion comes from the Latin word patior, meaning to suffer. So that's when these gods started to suffer. They all have passion stories. And they all conquer death through resurrection, which is shared with their followers. Further, as Jim Lawrence explained, all are based in early human history setting without conclusive evidence of their existence. Okay, this next slide makes the same point. This I took from Mike Enright's presentation, Is Jesus Real? Mike is a great speaker. And as missionary propaganda, Christians spoke to pagans in a language they understood because this was a marketing effort, okay? And so as you can tell in looking at this slide, that many of them were resurrected. If I had a laser pointed, that's at the bottom. Many were buried for 3 days. Many traveled with disciples performing miracles. Many had a virgin birth. That's at the top of the page. Many were born on the 25th of December. Okay. So we've gone through the first 2 points of arguments against the historicity of the resurrection. Okay, the third point, bullet point. The empty tomb is a marketing fiction. This really goes hand in glove with point number 2. The empty tomb is a marketing fiction for the purpose of missionary propaganda. What do you need if you model the Jesus story after the Greco-Roman dying and reviving gods who die, are buried, and then raised from the dead? Well, if you're a Christian, you got to have an empty tomb. So you fabricate that story because, again, you're trying to market this Jesus idea so these pagans will believe in Jesus and reject their own gods. However, that's not the end of the story. The empty tomb story has other credibility problems. That is to say, how does one explain all the differences in the different gospels regarding the empty tomb story? And this is a talk in itself. All 4 gospels have shared the empty tomb story. However, who was the first person to the tomb? Was the stone already rolled away when the women arrived? Which women arrived? Whom did they see? 1 man, 2 men, an angel, Jesus? What did the divine person or representative tell them to do? Were they advised to go to Galilee and tell Peter and the apostles of the resurrection? In some of the gospels, they were told to stay in Jerusalem and not go to Galilee. Did the women immediately go and tell the disciples what they saw, or did they not do this? Did the disciples see the resurrected Jesus or not? If so, where did they see him? In Galilee or in Jerusalem? What does all this mean? The answer is that the many factual differences in the gospel accounts of the empty tomb is a result of the story not being anchored in reality, okay? The gospel writers couldn't keep their stories straight. Further, the reason St. Paul, I told you I'd mention this a moment ago, the reason St. Paul doesn't mention the women at the empty tomb, again, he's writing in 54, 55 AD in 1 Corinthians. The reason he doesn't mention the women at the empty tomb is that this story had not yet been fabricated, okay? That's the argument. That the Gospel of Mark wasn't written until maybe between 60 and 70 AD, another 20 years after Paul was writing his letter to Corinthians. And so that story was created as the early Christians needed to have an empty tomb for marketing purposes. Okay, last point. Here's the first 3 that we've gone through. Our 4th point. Jesus' body was not removed from the cross, and since his body was not removed from the cross, he was never buried. And he wasn't buried, his resurrection is a fiction. This is the 4th bullet point. What does that mean? Keep in mind that the Roman practice of crucifixion, that Rome executed criminals who were not removed from the cross. To do so defeats the whole purpose of crucifixion, which is to humiliate the victim and deter others from seditious acts. So the criminals who were crucified, it was always on a high hill or at an intersection where everybody could witness this gruesome act. If you defy the power of Rome, if you say you're the king of the Jews and only the emperor is king and divine and so on, then you are a Benedict Arnold. You're a Benedict Arnold, okay? And this is what's going to happen to you, okay? That's what the Romans are doing. So to remove the body from the cross defeats the whole purposes from the Roman point of view of why you're doing the crucifixion. That's an argument in favor that Jesus' body was not removed from the cross. Okay, further, it doesn't make any sense that the entire Sanhedrin, and remember I mentioned this a moment ago when I was talking about the Gospel of Mark, condemned Jesus to death on Thursday evening because he was a blasphemer. He said he was the Messiah and the Son of God, and that was blasphemy to the Jews. They condemned Jesus to death on Thursday evening, and then the next day, Joseph of Arimathea, out of compassion, so it says in the Gospel of Mark, petitions Pilate for permission to remove the body from the cross and to bury it. Okay, now let's think about that a minute. Does it make any sense that Joseph would condemn Jesus to a tortured death on Thursday evening as a blasphemer, and then the next morning he changes his mind, feels compassion for him, and has Jesus buried at his expense in a family crypt? Do people really work that way? I'm going to execute you. You're going to be tortured and crucified. Oh, the next morning, no, on second thought, I'm going to give you an honorable burial. Okay, probably people don't work that way. That's the argument. Additionally, from what we know of Pontius Pilate, he was cruel, arrogant, venal, and indifferent to Jewish sensibilities. That is, he was not the sort of ruler who would have granted a Jewish request to accept Jesus from the fate of those crucified, which was to be eaten by wild dogs and scavenger birds, or to be buried in a common grave. Pilate condemned countless Jews to crucifixion, and he could have cared less about giving Jesus a discreet burial or pleasing the Jewish Sanhedrin. So, summing up, closing arguments for the resurrection, we have Paul's character for truthfulness. He was a good person. He spoke the truth. That was his vocation. Paul's identifying eyewitness testimony to the resurrection. He's telling the people of Corinth, go talk to the people who are still alive, who really saw this. Okay, we have eyewitnesses. Oops, sorry, I made a mistake. Can I go home now? And that is to say, the apostles chose a gruesome death rather than recant, not a belief, but the experience of the resurrected Christ. That's the argument. And then lastly, Mark's identifying women as the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection lends credibility that the story is true. If the story were made up, the author would use a credible witness, a male Jew, and not a gaggle of flaky, unreliable women. Okay, the argument against the resurrection, the 4 bullet points. Paul's testimony has curious gaps, and he personally lacks his own eyewitness experience of the resurrected Jesus. He's really giving us hearsay testimony, which can be very unreliable. I mean, when Lou is on the witness stand, we get to evaluate whether he's shifty. Is he looking at us? Does he mumble? I can't believe that guy. He doesn't act like he's honest. Okay, that's what hearsay testimony gets us in trouble. Second bullet point, in order to market the Christian God to pagans, Christians fashion the Jesus story in light of the dying, reviving God mythology, which was very popular in the Greco-Roman world in the 1st century AD. Part and parcel of that, the empty tomb is a marketing fiction for the purpose of missionary propaganda. The pagan would say, well, I believe in a dying, reviving God. Well, we've got that too. He's got an empty tomb. He was resurrected. He dies and revives. Hey, believe in Jesus. And then lastly, Jesus' body was not removed from the cross because that didn't make any sense in the Roman scheme of things regarding why they were crucifying someone. It was a deterrent to sedition, all right? Because Jesus was a troublemaker. They didn't want more troublemakers. And since his body was not removed from the cross, he was never buried. And if he wasn't buried, his resurrection is a fiction. So ladies and gentlemen, as in any trial, you have to decide which side you believe. What's your verdict? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Before we go into the breakout rooms, we're going to put up a couple of questions and ask the people online to kind of give us their opinions. So Ian, if you would put up the polling questions, please. I will put them up here so people can see them. Come on, people. Okay. So we really have 3 questions we want to address. How helpful is it to discuss the resurrection as an historical event rather than an article of faith? Very, somewhat, a little, not at all, those kind of answers. How persuasive or compelling are the historical arguments? And we move this up so we can see it more clearly. Do the historical issues for or against affect your perception of the resurrection? So we'll leave this up for a couple of minutes, a minute or two, and see what the people online say. We have about 20 some odd people online. So let's see what kind of answers we get. We have 19 online, okay. You want to think about this and we'll talk about it during the breakout room. What your opinion of this is. How how does a historical viewpoint mesh or disagree with an article of faith, a faith viewpoint? Are they compatible or are they contradictory at this point? We'll leave that up another minute, maybe. See, people are answering. Let's see what we're getting. Let's do it this way. Let's see if we can get those last two people to give us some opinions. Okay, Ian, why don't you go ahead and post up what we've got? Let's close this out. Okay. Boy. Well, I guess that's a misprint on the slide. How helpful is it to discuss the resurrection? Most people said somewhat helpful, very or somewhat. So yes, it's useful to discuss articles of faith in a historical context. How persuasive are the historical documents? Well, somewhat. Not as overpoweringly very, but there are some validity to the historical. And I think the interesting one on the end is, I don't have no idea what just happened there. Does it affect your perception? And the answer is, well, somewhat. About a third said no. About 2/3 said either yes or somewhat. So I think it's an interesting point of view that we are now willing to discuss articles of faith in a historical context. So let's take this down. And Ian, if you would go ahead and put us into the breakout rooms, please.